Owen, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be sharing coaching insights at this late hour in Dublin, Ireland. And as I was telling Owen before we began this evening, this is my first official chat with the broader GA community. And so as someone who has sat through and watched many a final in both hurling and football, it's an absolute pleasure to be interacting, albeit remotely, with a diversity of coaches who I know have such a deep respect and love for sport at large, but most certainly in developing themselves as a coach and nurturing those amazing skills that we see on the Emerald Isle. I also know we have many coaches across the world, across sports, and I think that's what's great around the topic this evening, right? The language of coaching. Every single one of us as a coach, as a movement professional, understands the importance, right? The rate limiting importance of our words. We use them every single day to build relationships with our athletes, to convey our points, our cues, our feedback. There is not a session that goes by where language isn't at least in part at the forefront of what we're doing. And as coaches, we have this deep-seated desire to ensure that our athletes understand us as we seek to be understood, to get the information right off of the program and into the person. At the end of the day, we don't have strings attached to the athlete that we can pull to get them in just the precise position. We have to use other means, whether it be drills in the environment, but notably our language. And as Jer talked about, I have had a love and an interest in coaching language for as long as I can remember over my 17-year coaching career. And for whatever reason, I just gravitated towards it as such an important feature, but yet one that was massively underrepresented in my own development, collegiately and professionally. And thus it was an area that I sought to improve in as a coach first and as an academic second. Now, what we need to recognize to get the most out of this evening's presentation is that all of us on this call are coming from different backgrounds, and we have a different canvas. Some of us work with young athletes, some of us work with elite, some of us are in GA, rugby, possibly football, and other sports. The beauty of what we're going to talk about is it doesn't matter what your canvas is. Tonight, what connects us is the principles that underpin how our language transforms an athlete's focus, and ultimately how what our athlete focuses on determines how they move, not only in the moment, but the learning long term, notably, hopefully, when it counts in a performance context. Now, what I'd like us to do as an exercise is I just want you to reflect on your own sport for a moment, recognizing that we use coaching language for many, many different things. But I want to center us in, because we only have 40 minutes plus time for questions here, I want to center us in on a specific viewpoint of our sport. And that is the development of skill, the development of the technical movement that underpins skill. So on the slide you're currently viewing, you see the skill of sprinting. That could be possibly the skill you're imagining. For others, it might be kicking, it might be throwing, it might be catching, it might be passing. But I want you to think of a skill you teach all the time. And we are going to use that as our background canvas, because that's then going to allow you to apply all of the principles you're learning this evening to that specific example. In doing so, it'll brighten the ideas that I seek to share, making it much easier for you to transfer them to all the other diversity of skills you likely teach, notably for those of you in GAA. Now, with this, we're going to go on a journey. And the goal is at the end of this journey, you will walk away with two key coaching models, coaching systems. Think of them almost like coaching software that I hope you can download from me to you over the next 40 minutes. And what these systems are going to help you do, I want to be very specific so that you know from the very beginning what you're going to walk away with. These systems are going to help you identify the right words at the right time, right, to help that person move better. That's it. It comes down to you finding the words that work, that help the athlete focus in a new way, such that that focus allows them to get the light bulb moment in that skill execution. And in doing so, I want these systems to help you achieve something quite specific. And that is, I don't want to help you identify words that only work when you remind the athlete, right? Have you ever had that experience where on a Monday you're coaching someone, you're queuing them up and you're making the change? You think the change is permanent. They come back for the next training session, let's say it's on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and all of a sudden you're pulling your hair out because it's as if men in black have gone into their house and erased their memory. And it feels like they're back at square one. Or that player that seems to train really well, practice really well, but can't translate it on to game day, right? These are all experiences that every coach has. And it's this concept that even though our words can work in the moment, the words that we really want to use, the coaching language that we really want to deploy should be sticky. It should be long lasting. It should be a cue that engenders a focus and engenders a change in movement that lasts, ideally, the test of time. And that, my friends, are the coaching systems that I seek to defend and share this evening. Now, to get you to these models, I want to tell you a little bit of story. I want to take you on a bit of a journey, and that journey starts with a question. And any of the questions that I'm going to ask throughout the evening, feel free to put your answers in the chat box. And obviously, if you have any questions as the presentation goes on, put those in the Q&A box, and we'll look to field as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And so the first question you might just consider on your own is, what is a coach? I think this is such an important question because in answering it, it starts to reveal why this thing, our voice, our coaching language is so central and important to defining it. Now, for me, the way I want to answer this is I want to give you a little bit of etymology, the history of our words. So the history of the word coach. You have to go back hundreds of years to the Hungarian city of Kocs, spelled K-O-C-S. And what this city became famous for was designing and developing the first horse-drawn coaches of the time. Now, obviously, these horse-drawn coaches carried likely nobility or those with the wealth to afford them, and they took them on a journey from where they are to where they want to be, oftentimes over treacherous terrain that wouldn't have been easy to navigate or comfortable to navigate on foot or on horseback. But fast forward, and the word coach continues to this modern day. We get in a coach, which I call from the States when I'm there, a bus, to navigate the motorways of Ireland. If you're me, when I get on a plane, I ride in coach to get from where I am to where I want to be. In the wild, wild west, right? We talked about stage coaches. And so the word coach, for as long as it's been around, represented a vehicle that takes someone safely from where they are to where they want to be. I love now that we have appropriated the word coach and we've applied it to our field. And for me, that field is broadly the movement profession at large. And so what is a coach? Well, a coach is a person who takes others from where they are to where they want to be. This is why when I talk about a physio, I talk about a nutritionist, I talk about a rugby coach, I talk about a strength coach, we are all coaches because we proverbially guide individuals from where they are to where they want to be. The question is now, how do we go about doing that? Well, a couple variables have to be considered when we talk about this journey that we are guiding, that we are facilitating as a coach. The first thing is we need a destination. We need to know what we are trying to coach, what we are trying to change. Now, if I had more time, I would normally go through different ways to tease out what to coach. But for our purpose tonight, I want you to go back to your mental canvas. I want you to go back to that specific skill you're thinking of that you coach on a daily basis and identify within that skill what's something that commonly goes wrong. What is an error or a technical feature that you find yourself communicating, talking about, cueing again and again and again? In the context of tonight's discussion, that's what we're going to call the destination. It's the change, the outcome you seek to achieve in the movement or skill you are coaching. Once you've identified that, and that is a critical thing to identify, hence the reason you have to put the address in the GPS before the sat nav starts to work. The next thing though is, well, we have to consider the path. How are we going to get there? How are we going to facilitate the change? And a change that is lasting. And I cannot stress this enough. And I'm going to quote John Wooden, who's a famous basketball coach from the United States, specifically worked in UCLA, won many, many championships with them. And he said, I have not taught until they have learned. I have not taught until they have learned. We have not coached until they have learned. And what that suggests is that to call yourself a coach, to call yourself a teacher, to say that you are coaching, to say that you are teaching is to leave someone with something. They walk away better than when they came in. And thus they can continue to express that improvement, prove that they have arrived at that destination without further reminders, prompts, cues, or nudges. And so as coaches then, we want to identify the path that leads to the destination and allows that athlete to stay at that destination, to embody and continue to express that improvement long after the cue that instigated it, right? And so this is now where we will spend our time pivoting to coaching language. If we talk about a path, though, if we talk about how we will arrive at a destination, the question we have to ask ourselves is this: by what means do we influence the athlete that in a way ultimately determines the change, right? We don't literally have strings on their body. When we want to make a change to technique, it's not like I just pull one string or another. So this whole puppeteer analogy breaks down. But yet, on a daily basis, I see it with my own eyes. I am able to influence positively and sometimes negatively the way my athletes move. Well, by what means do I do that? And what I'm going to articulate now is central to this entire concept of the language of coaching and really coaching in general. And so the button I press, the knob I turn to influence movement is this thing I'm using right now to watch me. And that's my attention. That's my ability to focus on one thing versus something else. My reality is shaped by what I pay attention to. I cannot sidestep the defender I do not see. I cannot hit the baseball I do not watch. And so ultimately, for us to experience anything, we must pay attention to it. And thus, in paying attention to something, we have the possibility of gaining and learning from it. And so ultimately, attention, how we focus, attention is the currency of learning. If we do not pay attention to it, we cannot focus and learn from it. And so what that starts to suggest to us is, as a coach, no matter what tool we use, all roads lead to Rome, all learning leads through attention. And so every coaching strategy worth its salt is going to focus attention in such a way where I can pick up on the right things in my body, in the environment, in my opponent, whatever it is, such that I can learn from it. And let's just give some very simple examples. When you learn to ride a bike, it doesn't require a lot of coaching. Why? Because my attention immediately goes to keeping this thing balanced against gravity. When I'm learning to skip rope, my attention is immediately placed on whether or not the rope is going around my body. When I'm learning to pass a rugby ball, my attention immediately goes to whether or not it was successful. So this is why so much learning can happen naturally, because our attention gravitates towards the most important features of the environment, what we're learning. Ultimately, as a coach, our job is to shape and guide attention in such a way where the athlete focuses on the right things at the right time, to pick up on the information that allows them to improve their expression of skill. And so while we don't have strings, we have tools we can use to focus attention. And it's in the focusing of attention that the possibility of learning exists. And so how do we do this? What tools do we have at our disposal to influence attention such that someone can learn better? Well, let me read this statement and then we'll dig into it. Coaches can influence how the person focuses on the environment or how the environment captures the person's focus. And so what this is suggesting is there are two primary ways to influence attention. And thus there are two primary ways that we nudge learning. There's not three, there's not four, there are two. Let me explain. So coaches can influence how the person focuses on the environment. We do this through our language. You know, we talk about if it's a rugby ball, let's say in my world, we might have someone focus on the rugby ball when they're kicking it. They might focus on the trajectory, where they want the rugby ball to go, or equally, possibly where they want the rugby ball to land. We could come up with similar examples, I'm sure, in football and hurling. And so we can take our focus and we can zoom it out, we can zoom it in. But simply in changing that focus, I change the information available to me, and information is like puzzle pieces. They help me solve the puzzle that is learning to move. And so I can use language to directly take this attentional spotlight and have you focus it on different areas of your body, the implement or the environment or the opponent or the teammate. And in doing so, it allows me to access new pieces of information that I then can use to shape the skill I'm learning. Equally though, how the environment captures the person's focus. I can start to manipulate the environment directly. I can use nonverbal strategies that we commonly refer to as constraints. Now surely these always go together. There's always something happening in the environment. You know, I'm using cones or I'm using spatial constraints or I'm changing the rules, but equally I'm going to use language. The key thing to recognize is the environment draws our focus out, just as well as we can use language to draw our focus to specific features of the environment. And so these become the two tools that we use. Change something about the environment such that the body has to adapt to it and change the skill expression. Equally, change something about how the person focuses on the environment. And in doing so, that shapes, nudges, and changes how the skill is expressed. The reality is, we could take an entire week to talk about both of these, but we're going to focus on the verbal piece. We're going to focus on it because everyone uses it, but very rarely do we consider the underpinning strategies that allow us to get the most out of it. My goal here again is to move your success as a coach from chance to choice. How do we do that with our linguistic strategies? How do we become communication athletes? Now, earlier in this presentation, I asked you again, think of that canvas, think of that skill. I want you to go back there for a moment. I want you to drop yourself into that learning and coaching arena. You're with your athlete or athletes, and you're starting to work on this skill or the drills you use to coach this skill. What this starts to create is an arena that houses all the communication you use when you are teaching things. I'm focusing on this learning arena because we use communication both on and off the pitch. We use it to give a team talk. We use it to give a debrief. We use it when we talk about selection. And so language is used across a diversity of scenarios. The language that we are talking about is highly categorically specific to the words you use to coach and guide the development of movement skills. To articulate those categories of language you use to teach movement skills, I want to share the first of multiple models this evening. This model is called the coaching communication loop. This captures all the primary categories of communication you will use when you're on the pitch, on the court, in the weight room, teaching movement and teaching movement skills. Now, can you use the strategies here more broadly when you're giving a team talk, when you're talking about tactics versus technical execution? Surely you will find overlapping generalized principles. But I want to be very clear with what I am trying to share, and that is the language you use to develop the specific technical skill sets that all sports and the tactical execution of them depend on. And so very much so, we are in the teacher mode when we're thinking about these different categories of communication. As you can see on screen here, I'm calling this the coaching communication loop because these strategies loop around the drills, loop around the technical movements that you are teaching like a song on a loop. There are two different loops, though, that we'll refer to. The first one is what I call the long loop, and that is going to be used when you're teaching something for the first time or you're reviewing a movement. Once you are working with someone who is familiar with the drill or the movement you're teaching, you then pivot to the short loop, which is just the last three categories. This will become clear, though, when we go through the long loop. To begin with, when I'm teaching a movement, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to describe it. And so your first entry into coaching communication is how you physically describe a movement. And so this is typically where you talk about possibly the rules of a game. You talk about the technical elements of the movement you'd like to see. If we're in the weight room, we might also talk about safety. So if it's a back squat, how do I set myself up in such a way where I can accept the load on the bar? And so the describe it is where you give all information required for them to safely execute the movement and to be familiar with the movement they're about to perform. Almost think of it as psychological readying. We recognize, though, as coaches, that oftentimes there's a lot of information in those initial descriptions. And so we tend to do something very specific when we coach movement for the first time. We also give them something visual to sit along the verbal. And so we give them a demonstration. This could come from you as the coach. This could come from another athlete demonstrating, or possibly the use of visuals. But you give them these two sources of information so that they're very clear on what, W-H-A-T, what they are required to do. But as coaches, I think we quickly recognize that there's a lot of information in there. Even with sprinting, if I just leave it up to the athlete, there are many different things they could think about. They could think about nothing. They could visualize chasing someone. They could focus on front side mechanics, backside mechanics, arm action, posture. And so there's an infinite level possibly of what they could think about. And so this third step is commonly used. We will give the athlete a cue. That cue is that brief phrase right before they move. And that brief phrase is meant to center their focus on the one thing that we believe will help them improve the pattern, right? It's that destination in mind. What's that technical feature I seek to improve? I give them and upload the cue that I believe will help them do that. From there, then, they perform the movement. Now, rarely should there be any verbal communication going on while they're moving, unless I'm saying push, 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 or using some other rhythm cue that isn't going to interfere with their focusing on the movement itself. And then the final step is the debrief, or the debrief it. Now, this conventionally is called feedback. And we could give an entire evening of discussion around feedback. But for us, I want you to think of the debrief having a very specific purpose, which is why it's part of the short loop. And that is, it's going to help you ascertain the next best cue the athlete should focus on. And I'd encourage you to write this down because it's nowhere in the presentation. The debrief should get you to one of the 3 R's. What are the 3 R's? R number 1, if the cue worked, if it made them better, then the debrief will net that you are going to reiterate the cue. And that will come with a discussion with the athlete. Hey, how did you feel? This is what I saw. What did you experience? Did the cue help? Yeah, it did. Okay, so we reiterate it. Number 2, they weren't quite feeling the cue. The potency wasn't there. Maybe it didn't make them worse, but it certainly didn't make them better. And so the second R is you refine the cue. You tweak it, you tinker with it to get it to the right level. I'll show you how to do this later on. And then the final piece is, the cue, you've been using it for a long time, its potency, its shelf life is over, or worse, the cue made them regress. It made the pattern worse off. So that third R then is you retire the cue. And so let me be clear, see how it says athlete plus coach. In no way does this just need to come from you. Our cues, both in their creation and understanding how to evolve them over time, should come from collaboration. Ultimately, it's about getting to the words that work, which means words that work in their head, that they understand. And so for not 1 second do I want to suggest that cueing is a one-way street that always comes from the coach. To the contrary, the best cues, as you can see demonstrated in the imagery here, come from a collaboration. And so what we now find is we have the categories of language use when we're teaching something for the first time, and then that loop of cue, do, debrief as I'm evolving a movement over time. What we are going to focus on this evening is this middle area that we call the cue. We're going to focus on it because it has the single greatest impact on the way your athlete moves in the moment and the learning of that movement long term. The key distinction between the cue and its friends, the description and the debrief, is the following. When I'm describing a movement and I'm talking about technique and body positions, when I'm debriefing a movement, possibly even doing some video analysis, again, talking about technique and body positions, I am elevating my athlete's knowledge of what to do, what the movement looks like. But as a coach, how often have you had this happen? An athlete comes up to you and says, Coach, I know what you want me to do, or even I know what to do. I just don't know how to do it. This is such a critical point that relays that knowing what to do and physically knowing how to do it are not synonymous. They are not the same thing. So the language we use in the cue needs to be specific to helping the athlete focus in such a way that they know how to physically perform the movement, and that cue has a stickiness, a gravity that allows them to learn the movement in such a way where it doesn't cause them to overthink. It doesn't cause this paralysis by analysis of having 20 different cues, but rather it simplifies the learning by helping them to focus on the right thing at the right time, allowing their body to physically groove through that focus and allowing learning that sticks. Now, I emphasize this point for a very simple reason. Categorically, what I'm going to encourage you to say in the cue is going to be in part, not whole, but in part, different than the type of language that can go into your descriptions and debrief. This will become clear over the next few slides. I put that disclaimer on this because not for a moment do I want to suggest that you need to delete any of your coaching language. No. What tonight is an exercise in is learning how to categorize your language. So you say the right things in the right order at the right time to optimize the quality of their learning experience and ultimately the learning itself. And so I'm going to reference back to this again as the presentation goes on. The first question one is going to naturally ask themselves once we start talking about cueing that we just need to get off the table is, well, hold on. Before we get into what to say, how many cues should I even provide? Now, we could get into the neuroscience of this, but I prefer a short story about Einstein. And the story goes something like this. Einstein was learning how to golf. And like anyone learning how to golf in this great country, right, this is a perfect example. Someone gets a golf coach. And so Einstein got himself a golf instructor. And so the golf instructor takes him onto the range and, of course, starts to teach him how to swing. And so the bucket of balls are there, and he says, okay, here's how you tee it up. Here's how you set up the club. Here's how you hold it. Here's the backswing, the downswing, the follow through. And pretty soon, Einstein is feeling overloaded. He says, stop. Casually walks over to the bucket of balls, reaches down, grabs as many as he can hold in his two hands, and he looks up at the instructor and tosses the balls. And as he does, he says, catch. Now, obviously, the instructor was surprised, is dismayed. All the balls come raining down to the ground. And Einstein steps in quietly and says, just as you cannot catch all of these balls, I cannot possibly think about every single one of these cues at the same time. Give me one thing to think about at a time. And I think this brilliantly articulates our own intuition around coaching cues and coaching language. We can only feasibly focus on one thing per moment of time at a time. Surely if I'm a sprinter, I could have a focus for my start, my acceleration, and kind of my top end speed. But in any given moment, I can only focus on one thing at a time. So if you take one thing away from this presentation, let it be this: that give your descriptions, talk about the movement, talk about the drill till you're blue in the face. But when it comes to giving cues, we want to keep those to one major point, one major focus at a time. Because ultimately, that is a natural built-in limitation of our own attention. The second we double that to 2 to 3 to 4, we ask the athlete to choose. We ask the athlete to try to quickly flip from one to the next. And all of these serve to frustrate them, frustrate us, and ultimately what suffers? The athlete and their performance. So keep it to one. And the way that you remember one cue at a time, how many addresses do you put in the sat nav when you get in the car? Do you put 2? Do you put 3? No, you put in one destination at a time. So especially when you're developing technical skill, one destination, one cue at a time. Once we get that off the table, the next question is, well, what should we be serving up? If it's only one cue, are certain types of cues better than others for teaching movement? Now, we could go into a long scientific dialogue here, but again, I want to keep this as practical as possible. And so we're going to focus on the categories of cues, and I'm going to give you a high-level breakdown of where the science says we should invest our language. The way you can think about the categories of cues, what you're going to say, is like the zoom lens on a camera. So if you imagine you have your iPhone, right, or whatever kind of phone you have, you can zoom in, you can zoom out. That's exactly what we do with our focus as individuals, and most certainly with our cues. So here's my canvas. I have someone sprinting. Let's start by zooming all the way in and say, what happens when we zoom all the way into the body? What kind of cue do we get when we're teaching a technical skill? Well, we get what's called a narrow internal cue. Narrow because it's zoomed all the way in, internal because it's referencing something inside the skin, inside the body. So here I have someone, let's say they're not getting enough push off the ground. A narrow internal cue is extend your hips as explosively as you can. From there, then I can say, well, hold on. The hips are only one of many parts involved in sprinting. Maybe I don't want to be so precise, worried that if I give them just a cue on the hips, maybe everything else will get lost. And so now I can zoom my camera out a level, still inside the body, and use what we refer to as a broad internal cue. So instead of saying hip, I reference a limb. Drive your leg back as explosively as you can. Brilliant. I go from hip now to leg. Instead of it being a single joint or muscle, it's a collection of joints and muscles. But then I start to recognize, well, hold on. We're not moving in outer space. We're not moving in some kind of a vacuum here. My movement is always embedded in a context, in an environment. And so wouldn't it make sense to give the cue more potency if it references the environment I'm interacting with? Enter in now a hybrid cue. Well, a hybrid cue, as you might guess, involves internal and external pieces. So drive your leg, there's the internal part, back into the ground. There's the external part, as explosively as you can. But then as I start to think through this further, I say to myself, well, hold on. You know, I am the one doing the movement. I am the mover. I am my coordination. It's not like I have this bird's eye view of my body and I'm controlling it by remote. So when I tell someone to drive off the ground in this context, it is assumed that the leg is involved. And so maybe I can get them to think less about the body and steps that could disrupt them and just give them a cue that references how to interact with the environment, i.e. an external cue. And so here we have something, right? We call it close external. Drive the ground back as explosively as you can. So the ground is right beneath me, it's close. And by saying drive the ground back, it is implied that my legs will do the talking, so to speak. But then finally, I can zoom all the way out and give the outcome of the task. Here I can then say, instead of it being close, it can be far away. And so now I say drive towards the finish as explosively as you can. We don't get more external outcome oriented, destination oriented than that far external cue in the context of sprinting. And so what this starts to give us is a framework of language we use when we cue. Now there's a sixth category that we call figurative language or analogy-based language, where the cue might be explode off the line like a jet taking off. Now, there's not literally a jet there, nor can this person transform themselves into a jet, but we can move as if. And so a lot of our language will traverse this kind of literal external, internal, and be more figurative, parlaying or focusing on the visual capacities of the brain to move like something else, bounce like a bunny, load like a spring, so on and so forth. And so when we take these six categories, the question is, which type of cues are best, or does it depend? Now, this is where you're going to have to do some additional homework, but I want to guide that homework. By my estimates, there are easily over 225 papers that have looked at internal cueing versus external cueing, right? Thinking about joints and muscles and limbs versus environment and outcome. And what we now have is easily over 90% agreement, 90% alignment by my estimates, showing that external cues and analogies consistently result in better performance in the moment, but here's the important piece, better learning long term. So there's something about external cues and analogies that mix with movement in a manner that is far more beneficial than when you give someone internal cues. And ultimately what we know is we can hide the micro inside of the macro when we give an external cue or an analogy. But when I tell you to think about your leg or your hip, there's still many other parts of the body that need to come into my focus if I start to chop it up step by step, joint by joint. And so what we now know is internal cues constrain the way I move, causing me to overthink, instigating paralysis by analysis. And so this is where I said I would encourage you to categorize your language. You can use all forms of language in your descriptions and in your debrief. Open it up, chat about anything, technical, internal, external, go for your life. But when it comes to synthesizing down to that one morsel, that one cue that will guide the focus on the environment they're interacting with to move better in it, we want it to be a hybrid, close external, far external, or analogy. Some resources will not only be my book, The Language of Coaching, but another one I'm holding up here, Attention and Motor Skill Learning by Gabrielle Wolf. She is the absolute pioneer academically. And if you go on Google Scholar, put in her name, you will find quite literally hundreds of papers reinforcing this message. Now, the question that people ultimately have at this point in the presentation is, okay, I recognize those different categories of cues. I most certainly cue across that. I even see how I might be able to categorize my language, but how do I come up with external cues? What happens if I only have one or two go-tos and I can't create any more? And this is where we're going to focus in final here on the cueing model, cueing in 3D, How do you actually come up with useful external cues that are going to help you identify the words that work? To do this, the 3D model, as you might guess, requires 3 different Ds. It requires 3 different ingredients. And these are the natural occurring ingredients that come in the form of high quality external cues. And you've already met most of these ingredients, and you'll reflect and see these in your own language when you design external cues and, dare I say, analogies. And so the first ingredient is this: distance. The cue itself is either drawing my attention to something close to me or far away. We saw that in the sprinting example. Am I thinking about driving away from the ground? That's close, or towards the finish. And so what this requires is that when you design an external cue, you need to have that person, place, or thing as a reference within the cue, i.e. you need a concrete noun. If I just tell you to extend your hip, well, extend my hip in terms of what? Remember, we never move in a vacuum. We're always moving in a context, in an environment, with an implement, in terms of an opponent or a teammate. And so a high quality external cue always embeds my focus in the physical surroundings. And thus we need a concrete noun to anchor ourselves. But once I understand where I'm focusing, close or far, I then need to understand, well, am I moving towards something or away from something? How am I organizing my movement in terms of this concrete thing in my environment? And this is where we get the second D, the direction. So am I moving away from the line? Am I moving toward the finish? And this linguistically is what we call our preposition: into, off of, away from, toward. These words give us an internal compass of how we're moving in space. To articulate how a small change in the direction, or in this case, the preposition, can change your movement, think of the following. I want you to imagine that you are sprinting as hard as you can down a track. In one instance, I tell you to drive into the ground. Drive into the ground. In another instance, I tell you to drive off of the ground. Off of the ground. Do those phrases, into versus off of, feel the same? Which one feels more reactive? Off of. Which one feels more forceful? Into. Which one likely feels faster? Off of. Pretty quickly, we can start to see how just a small tweak in our language can have a massive change in how a movement is organized. This reinforces why we only give one cue. So the richness of each word of our language in concert can fully imbue how this person focuses and experiences the movement in the world around them. But we need one final ingredient. Distance and direction tells me about the space I'm physically moving in and interacting with, but it doesn't tell me how to do that from a speed perspective. So the final D is the action word. It's the heartbeat of the cue. It's the verb, right? Am I driving, pushing, punching, exploding, bursting? And don't for a second think that this is trivial. This is critical. Take the 2 words, push versus punch. Push versus punch. Which one's more violent? Punch. Which one's faster? Punch. Which one would I use if I wanted to slow someone down? Push. Our words literally embed and exist inside of our body and how we understand and interpret them. And so in having these 3 Ds together, you have the ingredients to create infinite external cues to find the right words for the right person for the right movement change you seek. Let's give some examples now of how this comes to life. So here again, I have my canvas, my person sprinting. Focus on bursting out of the blocks. Very basic cue, but we see the ingredients, obviously. Bursting, that's my description. If I said focus on driving out of the blocks or focus on pushing out of the blocks, it changes the energy and the essence. Out of, well, that's my direction, but out of what? The blocks. The blocks embeds me in the physical environment I'm moving in. What about a bench press? Focus on smashing the dumbbells through the ceiling. It's a very violent cue. What if I said focus on driving the dumbbells towards the ceiling? Slows the whole thing down. And so here, smashing is my descriptor. Through is the direction. Through what? Through the ceiling. Even think about the difference of through the ceiling versus to the ceiling. To suggests I'm stopping at it. Through says I'm trying to generate enough force as if to explode through the top of it. These words bring great meaning that we can apply in how we focus and move. But again, only if we're giving that one major cue at a time. And so when we think of this then, why and how is this a benefit? Well, when I'm up against a movement, a technical change, a destination I seek, I've run out of ideas on my external cues. I now have this proverbial coaching language lock. I have my different dials that I can tune up, change the direction, change where they're focusing on in the space, close versus far, changing the verb that I'm using, a slow verb to a fast verb, or just something different to get that potency, that novelty back up so they pay attention to it. And if I use this analogy, I start to find the combination that ultimately unlocks the movement in front of me. And I'm not saying or pretending this is easy day one, but if you go through the process that I've outlined in this presentation, and notably in my book, this becomes a software you can download into your coaching operating system. And your brain can start to think like this. When I am out coaching and I face gridlock, meaning my cues are not working, my brain immediately starts to tweak these dials or pivots to analogies till inevitably I get those eyes lit up, light bulb turns on, and we see the progression of the movement. This works not only in one-on-one, but also when you're trying to do crowd control, global cueing, and you're trying to come up with words, phrases that impact the largest amount of people. And for those of you that work across ages, this is going to allow you to pivot far easier when you work with young versus more experienced athletes, because it allows you to quickly fine-tune your language to the person in front of you. How this actually works in practice is like this. I want you to always endeavor when you're giving a cue for the first time to start with 3. That means you start with all 3 Ds. That means there's a distance, a direction, and a description. There's a noun, that's the environment, a preposition, how I move in terms of it, and then a verb, what's the energy of the movement itself. And so I start with 3. Here I have a kettlebell swing. At the bottom of the motion, reach the kettlebell at the wall behind you. Right? It might seem like a mouthful, but I'm giving this cue, I'm making good eye contact, and I'm making sure I generate certainty in what I ask of them. When I get to the debrief, remember my 3 R's. If it works, I reiterate it. If it kind of works, I refine it. If it doesn't work at all or makes them worse, I retire it. Maybe it'll work with a different person on a different day. And so that's why step 2, if it's not quite where I want it, I start to shift the D's. I try a different combination, okay? At the bottom of the motion, push the kettlebell into the wall behind you. Or at the end of the motion, stretch the bottom of the bell away from your shirt collar. Ultimately, the cue doesn't need to work for you, it needs to work for them. You need to own the meaning, the destination, the change the cue seeks to make. But you need to paint that meaning with the words that work for that person, which is why when you collaborate with the athlete or athletes, you tap their language locker. You hear their phrases, their interpretation, and you can use that information when you regurgitate that one cue, that one focus driving the change. Now, coaches are notorious for inevitably coming up with those 1 to 2 word phrases. That's brilliant. We want to do that here as well. So step 3, final step, shorten and see. I don't need to tell this person at the bottom of the motion anymore. They know that. I don't need to say it's the kettlebell. They're quite aware that they're holding one. So now my cue can be pushed to the wall, push or wall. And what this does is it consolidates, it folds all that information into a dense little bit of language that's easy to guide the focus while they move, decreasing cognitive pollution in the process. But there's a health warning here. Too many a great coach comes up with these 1 to 3 word phrases that they push out into their entire athlete atmosphere. But when you get new athletes who show up, a key thing is to unfold your cues. Go back to the start with 3, give them the full context, so then they get the full meaning, and then they can better appreciate your short, witty phrases. I can't tell you how many coaches forget to do that, and they assume everybody has been on their own learning journey in understanding what these words mean. So always go back to the beginning, start with 3, right? Shift the D's, refine it, and then you shorten and C, adapting to those new individuals that join your group. What I want to do now is, just for time purposes, there's another model and examples in the handouts that you're going to get. So please enjoy those. It provides insights on analogies. But what we're going to do is we're just going to pivot here to the end to make sure that we have some time for questions, okay? And I want to leave you with a vision of what you can start to do from a proactive perspective if you apply these principles. Inevitably, you end up with something like this. This is one of 27 movement grids that I outline, and excuse the self-promotion of the book, but I want to give you an insight into what this can look like. Where inevitably, over here, in your core skills for your sport, you outline the details, the description of what happens in the movement technically, but then you start to build out your cueing grids based on those destinations, based on those technical elements you seek to improve. And so for me, there's 3 major areas that you can start to build out your cues. Here we have sprinting, where I have 3 major common areas where we might have errors. And I just start to build out lists of external cues using that 3D model. Some of them have all 3Ds, other ones are already in their shortened form. But either way, I go through the process of utilizing these skill sets to develop and articulate these cues. The second thing, which we didn't have time to get into this evening, but I want to share briefly, is what I call cue tape. And so when I'm teaching skills, I can oftentimes literally use pieces of tape on the body. And instead of referencing the body, I reference the motion of the physical pieces of tape or the clothing those pieces of tape sit on. And so let's take briefly here the example of someone who is caved or overly flexed in their posture. And for the life of me, I can't get them long and strong as we see in this picture. What can I do? Simply put, I put a piece of tape on the upper back, a piece of tape, literally strapping tape, on the lower back. And then I ask the athlete a question. Show me what the tape looks like when they're getting farther away. They flex. Show me what the tape is doing when they get closer together. They extend. Beautiful. I tell them, smash the pieces of tape together as you get off the line. I've yet to see it not work. And so, again, you can utilize these clever little cueing hacks to simplify the complexity of movement, giving a concrete physical reference to tape. And guess what? There's evidence on it. Thinking about the motion of tape is not the same as thinking about the motion of the body. So give it a go, especially for your more technical skills. And then the final thing you start to play around with is the building up of these visual analogies. Again, for a future talk, but the book outlines this in great detail. And so to close now, at the beginning of this presentation, we defined a coach. We said that the physical idea of a coach is now transcended into our field, and that we are then a vessel, a vehicle that guides someone from where they are to where they want to be. We recognize that we need a destination, but the key linchpin is the path we use to get there. We talked about a verbal and a nonverbal path, focusing on the verbal, leaving us with this. And that is, cues then are the vehicle we use to navigate, to help the athlete navigate the terrain of their mind in hopes that they will arrive at the desired movement destination. There is so much richness here. I hope tonight was just a spark, and that you will take that spark and build it into a flame, ensuring that the effectiveness of your coaching language shifts from chance to choice. I know you'll get more information on this, but for those who are interested in learning more, the book is available worldwide. I have a number of online courses completely free at thelanguageofcoaching.com. If you have any personal questions or clarifications, I know this was dense tonight, info@thelanguageofcoaching.com. And if you want the fresh insights, it's at Nick Winkelman on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you all so much for your attention. Hey, Owen, you're on mute, my man.
Class, Nick. I know Jerry's going to start the questions. Yeah, so take a drink of water. Get yourself set.
Thanks very much, Nick. Just maybe by way of a summary for myself and an opportunity then to to try and decipher some of the questions that have been coming in. So for myself as a personal take home, I really liked the attention focused and the spotlighting. I think all too often as coaches, we tend to think of the whole picture, and we get lost in a lot of, I suppose, unimportant things that can help the coach or can help the player. So I think for me, some of the things that I just jotted down for myself is find the words that work. And it's taken me 20 years to find some of the words that work for me. I remember doing an exercise one time where a good friend of mine wrote down all the things that are cued or said to players during a match or during training. And half of them are negative, first of all, and the other half are meaningless. So find the words that work is a brilliant take home. And then the other one that I really liked, and it's something that comes back to the point you talked about analogies and the DDCDD.
Yes,
that
there
is
you go.
something that can be easily remembered, and if you follow that, it's a magnificent tool for coaches to take away with them. So one cue at a time is another one. So Owen, we might maybe just have a look at some of the questions, and I know that one in particular that really caught my attention, and it was from Martin Barry, and this is something both Owen and myself have talked about a great deal, and that is just thoughts on this. Is what Martin Barry has asked: is there any research about how much players hear, and I suppose more importantly, what they retain when the coach is shouting either during a game or training session? You might maybe be able to give us some
Yeah,
your thoughts on that.
see the difficulty there is there's so much quality research being done in live action sport, right? Where they're observing, they're miking up coaches, they're miking up players. But what then is required is to actually go in moment to moment and say, okay, 6 minutes after a drill is done, how much do you remember there? What were you focusing on? So to be honest with you, Jura, I don't know if anyone has done that exact research. They certainly have done plenty in evaluating coaching behavior and retrospectively athletes' perception or experience of that behavior. And I'd be quite certain that I've come across plenty of research that would at least get at retrospectively how much information is the coach giving, how much can you retain? And of course, the narrative is always there that the less information and the more precise the information, the better the athlete's understanding and the better their experience of the learning process. I think as coaches, we can't forget, we want our athletes to enjoy learning. We want our athletes to feel like when they're in our presence, they get better. It's tough enough to learn, let alone play a sport. If on top of that, we put together unnecessary barriers by overcoaching, not using age or individually appropriate language, we just simply create barriers to progress that don't need to be there. And so even though I'm not certain that there's direct research, I think intuitively we know that athletes would be viscerally aware of overcoaching. And inevitably, when they're around that type of coach, they tend to tune them out from the get-go. And I think that's the danger of overcoaching and misusing language that every coach needs to heighten their awareness of.
But yeah, because even from thinking of this of a study, there's so many variables at play when you're dealing with in a team setting, the learning environment, the individual learners, the environment itself. So it's probably a difficult study to probably do anyway. There's a very good question here around I suppose what you talked about earlier is just the impact on allergies for players. So is it better for younger players than adult players, or have you found any difference?
Okay, so analogies, right? And so what is an analogy? Analogy is a comparison between something you're familiar with and something you're less familiar with, or in our context, something you're trying to learn. And so let's go back to the analogy I gave for sprinting. Let's say you have that person that when they sprint, they just kind of stay low the whole time. They're hunched over, they're running a mile a minute, and we're not getting any kind of transfer of power. There's a lot of cues I could give them to fix that. I could say, okay, get your chest up, drive your knee forward, give me bigger arm action. And pretty soon, right, it's just all a jumbled mess. It's spaghetti on a wall. Or I can say to them, hey, have you ever seen a jet take off? Yeah, I've seen a jet take off. Okay, what does a jet do? Does it stay level or does it gradually rise? It gradually rises. I say, okay, on your next repetition, explode and drive off the line like a jet taking off. And what that does is it hides all of that technical detail in a visual picture that I can easily virtualize in my own mind and apply to my body. And there's neuroscience to back that up that we don't need to get into. Now, I would ask the question to everyone listening, is there anything in there that seems uniquely more appropriate for a 9-year-old than a 29-year-old? And pretty soon, no. So what I always talk about is age-appropriate language, age-appropriate examples. And so, yes, the reason analogies intuitive, and I get this question every time I give the talk. People always ask, are analogies better for kids? The reason we intuitively know this is because we know they don't have the anatomy. Even if we gave them all the technical jargon outside of head, shoulders, knees, and toes, they're not going to know what to do with it. And so we're forced to use real life communication, real life phrases, examples, things that they can relate to, and those all happen to be analogies. The problem is, as people become more elite, yes, their technical knowledge improves, and so I can say things like extend this, rotate that, flex that, sure, but that's not the same as that language being more beneficial for an adult. Arguably, it's not. So still with adults, my primary language I use is by way of analogy. I come up with comparisons of things that they're familiar with that will map onto the movement that we are trying to perform. And so between external cues and analogies, you have a treasure trove that tends to work across the ages. It just so happens that analogies seem to be better for kids because all they have as reference points are real life examples that we use as a comparison to the movement they're performing.
This is a lifetime work for you, Nick.
Yes.
In terms of your research, but also your practice. So for a beginner coach or even a coach that has been performing for a number of years, how important would pre-planning be in terms of creating the questions that they want to use and the language that they want to impart? Because it doesn't just come natural.
Jura, I wouldn't have had to write the book if it did. So I guess we're in agreement there. So a couple different things. Planning is central. I believe so much in planning that I committed one of the chapters in my book to behavior change. Not behavior change for the athlete, behavior change for the coach. Because I recognize that I came upon these principles and committed myself to a depth that I hope no other coach has to commit themselves to avail of the benefits I tried to articulate this evening. And so I think a couple different things. Number one, I would imagine every coach on here, right? They have their notebook and they write out their plan. When they write out their plan, what I'd ask them to consider is, are they thinking about how they're going to approach their descriptions and their demonstrations? Are they going to show video? Are they themselves going to demonstrate? Are they going to have another athlete demonstrate? Have they put a little thought into what we might call the MVW, the minimally viable words? The minimally viable words, the least amount of words necessary when I'm introducing or teaching something required for that athlete to know what they're getting themselves into. And then from there, Jared, you've nailed it. There's two different categories of cues people need to think about, especially knowing that a lot of people on the call will be working in groups. And I call those your global cues and your local cues, okay? So global cues, what are those? I'm in front of a group of 20 athletes. I know that I'm teaching given technical skills. In my mind, I've already either A, evaluated my players, so I know the common mistakes across the squad, and thus I focus my language on those common mistakes. Alternatively, I just know the common mistakes that happen to go hand in hand with that technical skill, and I have those cues loaded up. If I know I'm not very good at that, or I don't have those cues loaded up, guess what I'm doing? I'm sitting down, pen and paper. I'm writing out the technical skills that I teach. I'm writing out the common errors, and I'm starting to work in the quiet of my own home, coming up with 2 to 3 key cues that either are external or analogy based. And in doing so, I start to work. I start to download this engine that I call the 3D cueing model. What then that allows you to do is have those cues when you're globally coaching a group of individuals, but also that it prepares you that when, oh, and I step up to you because we're doing a 5-minute block of work, everyone's working independently, and I see that you're struggling with something specifically, I can now step into your space. I go from global to local. I can say, oh, and what are you focusing on? You're like, I don't know, I'm just doing whatever. Like, okay, what do you think we need to improve on this next rep? You come up with a good answer. I'm like, beautiful. What do you think you can focus on to achieve that? I'm not certain. Then I can deploy an external cue and analogy. I come back to you a few minutes later and check in on how that worked. And so for me, it's this constant process of curating cues off the pitch, having them loaded up when I'm globally coaching on the pitch. And in going through that process, I get better at working this creative engine when I step in real time, face to face, working with an athlete. And so I'll tell you what, Jared, I don't think it takes more than 30 to 60 days of starting to build a language locker, a catalog of cues for your common movements and the common errors before you'll start doing this real time on the pitch. For me, I don't have to write my cues down anymore. I am confident I can come up with 10 brand new cues never said before on earth because of these models. And that's why I've put them in there, hopefully succinctly and in a manner that anyone can apply.
That kind of want to go into more in depth, not a little bit. That kind of lends itself then to what you're talking about earlier in terms of the 3 R's. So
yes,
cue, refine your cue, and retire the cue if you need to. So in a sense, there, as a coach, whether you're starting out or in extremely experienced, you're doing a little bit of reflection in action and reflection on action, probably after your session or before your session as well.
All the above, all the above. The whole idea of the refine, reiterate, or retire is that forces you in the moment. If that's your process, is I'm watching, I'm scanning, because when I go into that debrief, it's 2 people. My responsibility is that I have objectively watched what happened, that I am the keeper of the technical model, so to speak. Are we traveling towards it or not? But at the same time, I need to know, Owen, your experience. You might have made a little bit of an improvement, but I'm like, Owen, what did you focus on? And let's say you reiterate the same cue, push the ground away. How did it feel? To be honest, coach, not great. I didn't really get a lot from it. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking now, this cue is not going to stick with you. Even though I got a little bit of a nudge, I got a little bit of signal out of the noise that is your movement, that's not going to stay with you. And so I might say, okay, I told you to push the ground away. What do you think you might think about that could be the same thing, but makes more sense to you? And you're like, I want to explode at an opponent. Beautiful. Guess what? I'm stealing that, Owen. Now you're exploding at the opponent. And so this creates a real-time dialogue. It's autonomy supportive. It forces me to get you involved. It forces me to judge my success by what you do. I spent a decade with my eyes closed as I coached. And I guarantee there's a lot of people on this call that if they took a hard look have done the same thing. We're output only. We're just screaming cues like a machine gun, spraying everything into the ether, hoping something falls down, hits the brain, and makes them move better. And one day I woke up and I realized I was doing this. And I called BS on myself. I stepped back. I now watch clinically. I involve them in the process. And I work, as Jer said, till we get to the words that work. And guess what? It builds better relationships with your players. You become more autonomy supportive because it forces their involvement, and they have a better experience on top of it all.
A good friend of mine once recalled the coach has to be like a surgeon because it has to be specific and you cannot deviate from the exact point that you want to make an incision in. And that's exactly the same with the language. We spend too much time in jargon instead of giving real information and real purpose to making players better.
Yeah, 100%. And I know you have some people on the call. Oh, and you even said you work with very young kids. I want to be very clear that even though this was a presentation on verbal cueing, you can take these exact same concepts and bring them into what we might call visual cueing. And so let's say I'm teaching some kind of technique with the Hurley, whatever it is. And I know that there's a way I want it done, but I'm also aware that to try to articulate this to a 6-year-old is a fool's agenda. And so what I might do, knowing that the kid has probably grown up watching the sport with mom and dad, brother and sister, I do a demonstration. I don't tell them which is good and bad. And to this day, I do this in every one of my sessions. I say, okay, everybody, this is A, right? This is A demonstration. Okay, now this is B. This is B. Okay, now be a good student. What do we think? How many of you think A is best? How many think B is best? And without fail, as long as you are clear in your demonstrations of good and bad, I've never seen players not get it right. I've never seen them not get it right. And so what that starts to do is it involves them, it's visual cueing, but by its very nature, it becomes external because I'm not asking anyone to go head, shoulders, knees, and toes. And so we can think about this when you look at that coaching communication loop, and notably that demonstration piece as more than just verbal in our ability to articulate meaning.
There's a question here that I've been looking at it since you finished, and we spoke and I put it on Twitter that there's coaches from all around the world on this, and this is from Danny. I often coach in different places in which sometimes there's a language barrier and an accent barrier. How do coaches be so successful as, like, for example, Marcelo Bielsa, who can take teams but can't speak the same language as the athlete? So how important is your body or your facial expressions or in terms of what you want to achieve?
Couple things. One, that cues it up perfectly because the example I just gave you is one that I've always used when I coach in China or Japan, for example. It's never failed. You can say 1, you demonstrate 2, and you ask them 1 or 2, and they put their hand. So that doesn't fail. The specifics of the question, I call this the communication trinity. The communication trinity is your words, your tone, and your body language. 2 of those transcend language, tone and body language. They're not dependent on necessarily understanding the words. And so for me, if I'm coaching another language, it's how I'm looking and scanning around the room, how I'm carrying myself, possibly my use of claps, noises, and how I say things in English to accent certain points. Inevitably, if you don't have a translator, you likely would need one, but this is where video becomes critical. On your iPad or your iPhone, do you have video loaded up? You would have seen in my own presentation the amount of static imagery we've worked to actually show and articulate cues, but in a visual way, is something I hope the industry takes on board, and apps or whatever are developed so we can have literally cue cards, so to speak, that allow you to transcend language. The visual is always going to be there. The visual needs to be emphasized. And that A-B option, I think, is a beautiful way to articulate incredible nuance while supporting their autonomy. No direct language required.
Nick, I think we're going to maybe wrap it up. We know you've given your time this evening to be with us and to impart your knowledge and your expertise in this area. I know what book I'm going to be getting for Christmas, and I think Owen is similarly going to have one in his stocking around 4 weeks' time. So it's definitely an area that we're always looking to try and improve, because the skills and the activities that we try and impart can only be imparted by the use of appropriate language and how we communicate that. So I think I'd like to thank you on behalf of Dublin GAA for being with us this evening. It's been great to have somebody from another sport, because what it does is it reinforces a lot of good things that we're already doing, but it also gives us an insight into the world of other sports, and the fact that we're all trying to do the same thing, which is trying to make people better at what they do and make people enjoy the activities that they're trying to, I suppose, fulfill in their, whether they're sporting or their professional careers, to be brilliant at. So from that point of view, it is fantastic to hear your research, and I look forward to getting a chance to read your book and to put some of those cues and some of those attention focuses into practice as well. So I might just let Owen have the last word, and thanks very much, Nick.
Thank you, Jer.
Again, guys, Nick, again, thank you so much. It was great to chat to you beforehand for about half an hour, 40 minutes to kind of bend your ear a little bit. But in terms of the webinar, I'll be sending feedback to everybody who has been on the call, who signed up also. So please complete the feedback form when you do get it tomorrow. Again, Nick, this is all going to be on YouTube, so there'll be a lot of views that will be coming up in the next 2 months over this when we promote it, as well as we're going to promote your book as well. Again, guys, anybody who's still on, there's over 100 people still on the call, so please promote over social media, use the hashtag DGAA webinars, as well as language of coaching. You'll find Nick Winkelman on Twitter, tag him in it. Brilliant session, Nick, and again, we could have went on for another couple of hours because we only didn't even scratch the surface. So we'll definitely be, you've been on Jer's radar for a while, so you'll not be getting away too easy after tonight.
Yeah. No, listen, thank you all. Thank you, WGA. I mean, it's been an absolute privilege. And like you said, we're scratching the surface. This isn't going anywhere. So let's stick with it.
Guys, take care and we'll speak soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.